On the morning of May 12, 1944, 935 American bombers crossed into German airspace with an ordinary-looking assignment on paper, and yet by that afternoon, they had done something no fighter squadron, no tank division, no naval blockade had managed to accomplish in nearly 5 years of war. They had found the single thread that, once pulled, would unravel the entire German war machine from the inside out. And that thread was not steel, and it was not men. It was fuel, the invisible lifeblood, without which every Messerschmitt, every panzer, every U-boat was nothing more than expensive scrap metal sitting idle on a runway or a road or a dock. And what happened over the next 11 months would prove that you did not need to shoot down a single additional aircraft to win command of the skies. You simply needed to make sure the aircraft could never take off in the first place, to understand how a nation that once boasted the most advanced air force on Earth found itself, by the autumn of 1944, grounding its own fighter pilots, not for lack of aircraft, but for lack of gasoline. You have to go back to a fundamental and often overlooked weakness buried deep in the architecture of the Third Reich, a weakness that had nothing to do with generals or ideology and everything to do with geology, because Germany, unlike its rivals, had almost no domestic crude oil. Britain had access to the oil fields of the Middle East and the tankers of the Atlantic. The Soviet Union sat atop the vast reserves of the Caucasus, and the United States was, at the time, the largest oil producer on the planet. But Germany had a handful of modest wells and little else, and this single geological accident of birth would define German strategy for the entire war, from Hitler's obsessive fixation on capturing the Caucasus oil fields in 1942, a campaign that would end in catastrophe at Stalingrad, to the extraordinary and largely unheralded scientific effort that Germany poured into an alternative solution beginning as early as the 1920s, a process by which coal, of which Germany possessed enormous quantities, could be chemically transformed into liquid fuel. Two German chemists, Friedrich Bergius and later Franz Fischer, working alongside Hans Tropsch, had developed rival methods of doing exactly this: the Bergius process using high pressure and hydrogen to liquefy coal directly, and the Fischer-Tropsch process converting coal gas into liquid hydrocarbons through catalytic reactions. And by the time the Nazi regime came to power in 1933, these processes, once curiosities of industrial chemistry, became a matter of the highest national priority, championed above all by the chemical conglomerate IG Farben, which built a sprawling network of synthetic fuel plants across the German heartland, the largest and most important of which rose from the fields near the town of Leuna in central Germany, an industrial complex so vast it employed tens of thousands of workers and produced not only aviation gasoline, but nitrogen for explosives and countless other war-critical chemicals. And by 1944, this network of roughly 24 major hydrogenation plants spread across Germany and German-occupied territory was producing the overwhelming majority of the fuel that kept the Luftwaffe's fighters in the air. More than 90% of Germany's aviation gasoline, in fact, flowing not from any oil well, but from the black seams of German coal, transformed through a chain of pressurized reactors and catalytic towers into the high-octane fuel that a Messerschmitt Bf 109 or a Focke-Wulf 190 needed to climb, to turn, to fight. For years, this arrangement worked well enough, supplemented by crude oil from the Ploesti fields in Romania, Germany's single most important natural petroleum source, and a target the Allies had attempted at great cost to strike as early as August 1943 in the low-level raid remembered as Operation Tidal Wave, a mission that inflicted real damage on the Romanian refineries, but at a horrific price, with more than 50 aircraft lost and hundreds of airmen killed or captured in a matter of minutes over the burning refinery stacks, and for a long while afterward, the architects of Allied strategic bombing turned their attention elsewhere, toward German aircraft factories, toward ball-bearing plants, toward the cities themselves, engaging in a long and bloody debate about what exactly was the most effective way to break German war production from the air, a debate that would only be resolved in the spring of 1944 through the quiet, methodical work of an American economist wearing an Army Air Forces uniform, Colonel Malcolm Moss, and, more significantly, through the influence of the Committee of Operations analysts. Woe's intelligence officers had spent months poring over economic data, production statistics, captured documents, and photographic reconnaissance, gradually building an argument that the German war economy possessed a single point of catastrophic vulnerability, and that vulnerability was oil, because unlike aircraft factories, which could be dispersed into forests and underground bunkers, unlike ball-bearing production, which the Germans could substitute and stockpile, the great hydrogenation plants at Leuna, at Pölitz, at Brucks, at Blechhammer were enormous, fixed, unmistakable industrial complexes that could not be hidden, could not be quickly rebuilt, and had no adequate substitute. And if you could stop the Bergius reactors from turning coal into gasoline, no amount of German engineering genius, no number of jet fighters rolling off the assembly line would matter, because those aircraft would simply have nowhere to draw fuel from. This argument found its champion in General Carl Spaatz, commander of the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, who by the spring of 1944 had grown convinced that the oil campaign, not the ongoing campaign against aircraft factories, represented the fastest route to crippling the Luftwaffe permanently. And despite skepticism from some quarters, including concerns that resources were needed for the immediate demands of the coming invasion of Normandy, Spaatz secured authorization to strike German oil targets as a priority, and so on. That morning of May 12, 1944, less than a month before the Allied landings in France, American heavy bombers struck the synthetic fuel plants at Leuna, Berlin, Zwickau, Lutzkendorf, and Zeitz in a coordinated assault that German war production chief Albert Speer would later describe in the starkest terms imaginable as the day the technological war was decided. And he was not exaggerating for dramatic effect, because the numbers that followed were nothing short of catastrophic for the German war machine. In the months leading up to that raid, Germany's synthetic fuel plants had been producing around 92,000 tons of aviation gasoline per month, more than enough, barely, to sustain training programs and combat operations simultaneously. But by June 1944, that figure had been slashed roughly in half, and the bombers did not stop. They returned again and again throughout the summer, striking the same plants that German repair crews, working with almost superhuman urgency under Speer's direct orders, would patch back together within days or weeks, only to see the bombers return once more. And this cycle of destruction and hasty reconstruction repeated itself so many times that by September 1944, aviation fuel production had collapsed to a mere fraction of its earlier levels, some individual months seeing total synthetic aviation gasoline output crash to under 10,000 tons, a decline of nearly 90% from the pre-campaign baseline. And to grasp the human consequence of that number, you have to understand what it meant on the ground, at the airfields, in the cockpits, because an Air Force does not run on aircraft alone. It runs on trained pilots, and trained pilots require flight hours, and flight hours require fuel. And as the fuel dried up, the Luftwaffe faced an impossible choice between feeding its frontline squadrons or feeding its flight schools. And time and again, it was the flight schools that lost. squadrons in the last year of the war arrived with a fraction of the flight training that their predecessors or their American and British adversaries had received. Some German fighter pilots reaching their first combat missions with barely more than 100 hours in the air compared to the several hundred hours logged by their Allied counterparts. And this training collapse became a silent killer, every bit as lethal as enemy bullets, because a poorly trained pilot flying a technically superb aircraft was still a poorly trained pilot, easy prey for the increasingly experienced American fighter escorts now ranging freely over the Reich in their P-51 Mustangs, and even Germany's most extraordinary technological achievement of the war, the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, a machine so fast it could simply outrun almost anything the Allies put into the sky, found itself hamstrung not by any flaw in its revolutionary design, but by the same relentless fuel crisis, its jet engines demanding specialized fuel and enormous quantities of it during takeoff and climb, at precisely the moment when German fuel stocks were evaporating, meaning that this potential war-changing weapon arrived far too late and far too fuel-starved to alter the war's trajectory. Its squadrons frequently grounded not by combat losses, but by empty fuel depots, and Adolf Galland, the celebrated fighter general who had fought so hard to accelerate jet production, watched in frustration as the aircraft that might have contested Allied air superiority sat immobile on camouflaged runways for want of the very substance that should have been the least of Germany's technical problems. Meanwhile, out in the field, the effects rippled far beyond the cockpit, because the same synthetic fuel shortage that grounded fighters also throttled the mobility of German ground forces. The Wehrmacht's panzer divisions, designed around the doctrine of rapid, fuel-hungry maneuver warfare that had shocked the world in 1939 and 1940, found themselves by late 1944 husbanding gasoline with an almost desperate frugality, a crisis that would become brutally visible during the Ardennes offensive that December. The Operaiden history remembers as the Battle of the Bulge, where German planners built their entire strategy around the gamble that advancing panzer columns could capture Allied fuel depots to keep themselves moving, a gamble born directly out of the fact that Germany's own fuel reserves were no longer sufficient to sustain a major offensive without stealing the enemy's supply. And when that gamble failed, when the fuel depots were not captured in time or were destroyed by retreating American units, entire German armored columns were left stranded, out of gas, abandoned by their own crews in the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes. Tanks that had never been touched by an Allied shell, simply sitting immobile, useless, monuments to an empty fuel tank rather than a battlefield defeat. Back at the synthetic fuel plants themselves, the human story was one of grinding, almost gothic desperation as Albert Speer mobilized tens of thousands of forced laborers, prisoners of war, and slave laborers from occupied territories to work around the clock, rebuilding the shattered hydrogenation towers at Leuna and Pölitz, laboring under brutal conditions and constant threat of renewed air raids, managing feats of reconstruction that genuinely astonished Allied intelligence analysts who watched production figures tick upward again after every raid, only to order the bombers back once more. And this became the grim rhythm of the last year of the war. In the air, strike, rebuild, strike again, a war of attrition fought not over territory, but over industrial capacity, with Speer himself pleading directly with Hitler in increasingly urgent memoranda throughout the summer of 1944 that the oil situation had become the single greatest threat to Germany's ability to continue fighting, warnings that Hitler, consumed by the collapsing fronts in both East and West was often simply unable or unwilling to act upon in any way that could meaningfully reverse the trend, because there was in truth no solution available. Germany could disperse its fuel production into smaller underground facilities, and it did attempt exactly this in the war's final months, but such facilities took time to build and came online far too late and in far too limited a capacity to offset the losses. And Germany cooled and did import fuel from what remained of the Romanian oil fields, but Ploesti itself fell to advancing Soviet forces in August 1944, permanently severing that last major artery of natural crude, meaning that by the final winter of the war, Germany's fuel situation had transformed from crisis into something closer to strangulation, aviation gasoline stocks dwindling to levels that made any large-scale, sustained air operation simply impossible, a reality made starkly visible on New Year's Day 1945, when the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a massive surprise strike against Allied airfields in the Low Countries, employing nearly 1,000 aircraft in what was, on paper, an impressively coordinated operation that destroyed hundreds of Allied planes on the ground, but a closer look reveals the fingerprints of the fuel crisis all over the operation's aftermath, because the pilots flying that mission were disproportionately inexperienced products of the starved training pipeline, unfamiliar with long-range navigation and low-level formation flying, and German losses that day, many due to navigational errors, that the Luftwaffe, critically short on both fuel and trained manpower, could never hope to replicate, and indeed it never did, that operation representing something close to the last gasp of German offensive air power, after which the Luftwaffe increasingly became a force that existed on paper far more than it existed in the sky, aircraft sitting parked and camouflaged under trees and in barns, not because they had been destroyed, but simply because there was no fuel to fly them. A strange and quietly devastating image. Hundreds of some of the most advanced aircraft ever built up to that point in history, jets among them, reduced to expensive lawn ornaments, scattered across the German countryside for want of gasoline. By the time Allied ground forces crossed into Germany itself in the spring of 1945, they would find airfields littered with intact, flight-worthy aircraft, evidence not of a defeated air force in the traditional sense, shot down and destroyed in combat, but of an air force that had been strangled at its source, denied the fuel that was its true lifeblood, long before the final infantry battles for Berlin ever began. And this is perhaps the most important and least understood lesson of the entire oil campaign, that the Allies did not need to win every dogfight, did not need to shoot down every German aircraft. They simply needed to identify and attack the one vulnerability that no amount of industrial improvisation, no amount of forced labor, no amount of engineering brilliance could fully overcome. A lesson in the deeper mechanics of industrial warfare that would echo through military strategic thinking for decades afterward, the recognition that modern militaries are built not merely on weapons, but on the vast, fragile, and often invisible networks and rail networks, as in its tanks and aircraft, a lesson written in the wreckage of a once formidable air force that fell not primarily to superior enemy pilots or superior enemy aircraft, though those things mattered too, but to the quiet, methodical, unglamorous work of bomber crews returning again to the same smoking industrial complexes in central Germany, until the great chemical towers at Leuna finally stopped producing altogether. And in the end, the story of the Luftwaffe's final year is not really a story about fighter tactics or aircraft design at all. It is the story of a nation that built an air force on a foundation of chemistry rather than geology, that found a brilliant scientific workaround for its lack of natural oil, and that ultimately watched that very workaround, concentrated as it was in a small number of enormous, undispersible industrial targets, become the single point of failure that brought the entire structure crashing down, a reminder that in modern war, the deciding factor is not always the sharpest sword, but often the emptiest tank, and that somewhere in the closing months of 1944, in the scarred and rebuilt ruins of a chemical plant near Leuna, the outcome of the air war over Germany had already been quietly, irreversibly decided.